morning,
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
morning, everyone. This is John Roberts with TIP Strategies, and the gracious invitation of Golden Shovel. I'm always a little uncomfortable with webinars because I'm not sure who's actually listening, but we'll assume that everyone is happily attentive to this topic, which we at least are very passionate about. So what we're discussing today is the question of the disrupted economy and what that means and how you can respond to it as an economic development organization.
And John, as you jump into your presentation, I'd just like to say, first of all, we're just absolutely thrilled here at Golden Shovel to have TIP Strategies giving a presentation today. And just as you're listening in, you're going to be in assembly mode, so feel free to type in questions over in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll ask those questions to John and get his thoughts on them. So, the title today, Disrupted Economy, is your community ready for tech disruptions? And let me pass it over to you, John, once again, and thanks for being here today and presenting with us in Golden Shovel and GIS Planning.
Good. Well, and let me also say that if anyone with whom I do have audio contact, and mostly that's Victor at Golden Shovel, if he hears something that doesn't make sense to him, I certainly don't mind being interrupted during the presentation. Begin with our economy now, and I think the first thing that we need to understand is just how serious the last recession was, and what we have done on the slide in front of you is compared recessions going all the way back to the early 1970s, and then looking at the recession that began around 2007 and is really that we're now out of. But you can see that the last recession that we had, which was really the tech bust in 2001 to 2005, while relatively long, was much more shallow in terms of the number of months it took to regain the jobs that were lost. So that 7-year period was a severe hit to our economy, and I think we'll be arguing throughout that the effects of that are still with us today. Now, one of the most important aspects of that recession, and one that has caused economists to talk about a reset of the economy, has to do with education and skill levels. So here's something that we all know. This is the educational attainment of our labor force. And what this shows is what we all know, that about close to 2/3 of the population does not have a college degree, whereas about 39% does have. And that distinction between the more educated and consequently more skilled member of the labor force and the overall unemployment is something we need to take a look at. So this next slide shows the skills gap of the unemployment rate. And what you see here is that those educated workers have an unemployment rate dramatically lower than those without a college degree. In fact, during the worst of the recession, the unemployment rate for college graduates never exceeded 5%, even during the very worst of the recession. So this is something that's very important to us, and in understanding both our economy, and since we're about to have an inauguration this week, when we talk about the election a little bit later on, you'll see why we think this is so important. But this particular fact is also unique in our economic history. Never has there been such a big divide between the unemployment rate of the educated, that is, those with college degrees, and those without. So let us take a look at what that has actually meant. And this is the recovery by educational attainment. So when we put these facts together, the recession itself, the jobs lost during the recession, and the unemployment rate of those with and without a college degree, and we index it to 07, Now study this chart a little bit. I sound like a professor, forgive me for that, I'm not. But take a look at the recovery with those, the blue line at the top. Look at the recovery in terms of jobs regained versus those with less education. You can see that, again, indexing to December 07, that over 8.4 million jobs in the recovery went to those with college degrees. It gained 8.4 million jobs. For those with an associate's degree or some college, they gained about 3.1 million jobs. But for those with a high school degree or less, 5.6 million jobs were lost and only 80,000 jobs were gained. So there's a huge economic divide that has taken place here based on education levels. And again, I think we need to be as forthright and honest as we can in making these links to the current election and the economic effects not being limited to just this, but also the political repercussions. And this becomes even more pronounced when we look at where those jobs were lost. So manufacturing went from 26% of all jobs to 9% in just 30 years. One of the most radical restructuring in our own economic history. And when you look at the share of employment by sector, you see that same number compared to other employment sectors. And you'll see that everyone either holds their own or gains jobs. It's only manufacturing that takes this incredibly severe hit. So the question that is, again, both economic and political is how much of that is due to offshoring and how much of that is due to technology. We have some answers to that question. We'll hold those for now. So let's look at one aspect of this change, and to our thinking for economic development, the most profound change. And that's what a disrupted economy looks like. So we have, excuse me for that, we have three trends that we at TIP Strategies here in Austin and Seattle have considered the most profound in terms of what disruption is and what it means for economic development. The first of these three trends, and by the way, they do converge, they don't stand alone, they are linked. The first of these is that we've seen the emergence for the first time of asset-light business models. Now, what does that mean? What does an asset-light business model mean? Well, one thing it means, I guess it's the easiest way to describe it in terms of actual companies. And let's take Uber. Uber, as we all know, the ride-sharing service, really has no assets in any traditional sense of the word. They don't own the cars, and they don't have a workforce. But here's the astonishing thing. The value of the company, as shown by the stock market and all valuations of the company, is that Uber is worth more than General Motors. This is true. And it's still shocking to me, as it must be to most people who look at this. How can a company that has no assets, that has no workforce, that has made no investment, except in a small amount of technology really, be worth more than a company that owns millions of vehicles, has massive distribution networks, and tens of thousands of employees? So we've never seen asset-light business models before. So this is quite an extraordinary change. The second disruptive trend is the gig economy. And the gig economy is really defined as the 1099 economy, if you will. It's those people who apply their trade, that is, provide value to other individuals and certainly to major corporations without actually being employed by them. And this trend is an extraordinary growth trend. It's as extraordinary in its own way as the growth of the asset-light business model. And the third of the disruptive trends, and this is the one that is in some ways the hardest to get our heads around, but also the one that will have some of the most profound ramifications for us in economic development, and that's the non-ownership model. The fact that a new generation, a young generation, millennials primarily, but not exclusive to them, are beginning to question whether a lot of things that we thought we had to purchase and own are really something that we need to individually own. Now, we see that in Airbnb, and we certainly see it in the ride-sharing services. But we see it in a whole host of other economic factors, and we're going to explore some of those and also think about how these three different trends converge. So let's talk about what effects they have. Well, the first effect that this disruption has is on the supply chain, and we're already seeing this. Entire business units that we thought of as part and parcel of our economy are likely to disappear and are disappearing. And one of the most disruptive industries we won't be talking about, but you know it very well, is the retail industry. When you have a company like Amazon, which is certainly leading the way in all aspects of e-commerce, has an entirely different relationship to producers and suppliers than any company has in the past. Its effect on existing retailers, and you've probably noticed the news on Walmart, is significant. And that includes not only how the products are produced and where they're produced, but how they're distributed and what that has done to the middleman. The second thing we need to look at when we look at these disruptive trends is the labor pool. Now, we've already begun to see this massive disruption in the number of workers, ties to the gig economy, ties to the ownership model, but we're seeing it in very indirect but very important ways. One of the things that we're seeing is that the square footage per employee that real estate folks look at has been steadily shrinking. And the reason it's been shrinking is not because we're happier in smaller offices, but because we don't need those offices in the same way that we have in the past. In fact, the very concept of what it means to have an office is changing radically. And I would guess that many of you out there on the webinar right now are probably not in your office. You may be sitting at home, you may be in your car, you may be in someone else's office in your shared office. All of us, I think, have come to realize that the physical presence of an office is something that is not as important to us as it once was. And with it, we're beginning to rethink our whole relationship of labor. And then the third thing we want to look at is social norms, the culture shock around changing behaviors. Now, when I first presented this disruption session, it was well before the 2016 election got started, so about a year ago. And the question of social norms were really more about what you see on the slide, culture shock around changing behaviors, what it means to realize that things that you have taken for granted in your life, whether it's the old landline telephone, or whether it's a car with a CD player and CDs are not something you own anymore. All of these things caused a significant effect on the way we acted as individuals and consequently the way we thought about the economy. But now, this question of social norms really goes into a different kind of disruption. It goes into thinking about those earlier points. And those points are, what does it mean for a significant portion of the workforce who does not have a college degree? Remember, that's almost 2/3 of our workforce, to feel that they are no longer part of the economy. And the moment that you hear those words, of course, you're launched right into the middle of the debates that took place in the 2016 election. So moving ahead from that, and we'll return to this point because it's such an important one, because I think it will dictate how we as economic developers have to ply our own trades. So what we're going to look at next, excuse me for jumping around here, is the ways in which particular industries are affected by these disruptive trends. Now, manufacturing is one that everyone is talking about. We'll talk about it a little bit, but not specifically around the aspects of manufacturing that are changing so rapidly with 3D printers and other things. We'll save that for another discussion. The same with healthcare. Profound changes in healthcare and entertainment, as we know, with VR and AR, augmented reality, rapidly moving in. We're going to focus only on transportation right now. And this is just a sample of many, many sectors. In fact, one of the earlier questions I received was, well, what sector of the economy did we think was immune from this disruption? My answer was there is no sector of the economy that's immune from this disruption. So we're going to focus on only one, and that's on transportation. And we're going to look at what that means for each of the three areas that we've talked about, in terms of the supply chain, certainly in terms of the labor pool, and also in terms of the social norms and the disruption that's caused. So this is a case study, and this is a case study about autonomous vehicles. So I like this slide very much. I think this is from 1957. It was an ad from, I think, America's electric light and power companies came and put this together, which is really, I mean, it's fun to look at, but it's also amazingly prescient. If there's a family cruising down an interstate with some great futuristic-looking vehicles, and the family is playing, well, I don't know what board game they're playing, but they're not watching the road. So is this just fun, or is this, in fact, looking at a future that we will experience? Well, before I go to the next slide, let me tell you that a number of the most influential thinkers, both in the industry and from the robotics and transportation side, as well as from the ride-sharing services, are saying that anyone who is born now, in the last year or two, will never drive a car. Now, you heard me right, and I think if you listen to that and think about it, we don't know if it's true, of course, but imagine that it were. Imagine that these predictions, which are coming from very reliable people, are true, that anyone born now will never drive a car. So I'm not talking as a futurist. I'm really thinking about this, what it means for us currently, and that's what these next slides are going to show. So let's talk about autonomous vehicles as they exist now. And those of you who watch the news will know that starting this fall, the first driverless Uber service began operations in Pittsburgh. Again, this is not some futurist talking. This is what's actually happening right now in Pittsburgh, and not only in Pittsburgh. It's starting to expand from city to city. Literally, you have the choice. If you're in Pittsburgh this morning, I think we do have one participant who is in Pittsburgh, and so they can confirm later whether that's still true. But you can call up an Uber and select a driverless vehicle to come get you. Now, whether or not that's still continuing in Pittsburgh today is less interesting to me than the fact that we think that this is, in fact, a trend that is irreversible. And let's take a look at how widespread the idea of self-driving vehicles is. In San Francisco, an Uber bought Otto, nice pun on the name there, O-T-T-O, bought Otto, and Otto is a self-driving truck. That truck has already been tested, and I think we have some folks from Colorado. They will also know that a beer delivery was made, I think just a few months ago, driven entirely autonomously from, I think it went to Boulder, but I'm not sure. It originated in Colorado Springs. So someone was very happy to get their beer, maybe a little bit shocked that it was delivered to them without a driver. So these technologies, we believe, are not only inevitable, but that they will have extraordinary shocks to the system. And here's why the shock will be so profound. We took a look at the most common job in each state in 2014. And this, you might have seen this on NPR. It was actually done by the University of Minnesota. We had started to do our own research and realized that it had already been done. We were happy to see that. But take a look at all the states, and that sort of teal blue indicates truck driver. And with the exception of a small number of states, it is the most common job within all of the job sectors. So if the truck driver is the most common job and autonomous vehicles are in the ascendancy, what is that going to mean? Well, we did a little bit further research and we looked at an article called Truck Driver Shortage, Is It Self-Inflicted? And one of the extraordinary things about this from the trucking industry itself is they don't seem to realize the near inevitability of this change to autonomous vehicles. You have a trucking generation of 45 to 54-year-olds, the largest of any other age group in the industry. So it's an aging workforce. And right now, they can't get drivers to fill the jobs, even at a relatively high median hourly wage, which is the national average for production supervisor workers. So it's a living wage, much better than many of the retail jobs that are out there. So we're looking at the age of the truckers here, and we're looking at the total driver openings forecast through 2025, which is 890,000. Almost 1 million jobs are going to be available in trucking, and they're having trouble filling them. At the same time, completely independently, well, not completely independently, but related to this, is the fact that you have different solutions to the problem of the availability of the workforce. Now, I need to pause there and let that sink in for a moment. We have huge demand within the industry for particular workers, at the same time that we have an emerging technology that will make those jobs obsolete. There's every reason for the industry, and by the industry, I'm not talking about the trucking industry per se, but I'm talking about the entire supply chain, to say to themselves, why should I try to fill these jobs if I have an alternative that will be available to me soon? Now, take a look at the next slide, and you'll see, excuse me for that, that we have, I see a little glitch here on the employment and jobs. You'll have to forgive me for that. Here we are. So this is the employment numbers in the U.S. on select industries and occupations affected by autonomous driving. So we're going to go beyond just the trucking industry, and we're going to look at the entire sector. And what you see there is that 3.3 million is the number of people that would be affected in the trucks and delivery drivers. You have another million folks who are taxi drivers, chauffeurs, and bus drivers. So these are all of the jobs that would be affected by autonomous driving. Then you've got another 200,000 automotive equipment rental and leasing. You've got 1.8 million who are in car dealerships and automotive parts stores. And you have nearly 500,000 in insurance carriers. Now, why did we put insurance carriers into that mix? We put it in there because the reality of self-driving cars, whether we're excited about them yet or not, is that, well, robots don't get drunk. Robots don't text and drive, or if they do, they can still pay attention. I'm being a little bit silly, but the reality is that we are much more at risk when we have human drivers than we are when we have drivers, cars that are being driven autonomously. I know that's a little bit hard to adjust to, but just by way of reminder, there was a time, I think in my lifetime, when you couldn't get into an elevator without having an elevator operator. Those of you who are millennials out there will find that a little bit hard to believe, but it's true. And that change, when it occurred, as soon as it occurred, it seemed silly that we had to have someone that would push the buttons of the elevator for us. But there were fears about the elevator and anxieties about new technologies that we overcame, and overcame relatively quickly. So with that in mind, I'm going to move on to the next slide and talk about how it doesn't end just there. It also ends, it doesn't end actually. It ripples out across a number of different sectors, and those are profound. So let's take a look at just one of those, and that's private ownership. So this is the convergence of the three trends again. When you have autonomous vehicles and you have a group of millennials who don't value private ownership the same way that their parents may have, you really have to ask yourself, why do I need to own that vehicle? How important is it for me to have possession of it, to pay for the gas, to pay for the insurance, the capital costs going into it in the first place, my monthly lease rate if I decided to lease the vehicle? All those are very high costs, as most of you know. We kind of take them for granted. But what if we didn't need to own it? What if, in fact, we could call up the vehicle on demand? That would free us up in extraordinary ways, and we could have multiple vehicles. We could have an F-150 pickup when we needed it. We could have a van when we needed to take a number of kids out. We could have a luxury car if we wanted to be chauffeured. So there's a whole variety of things that private ownership limits us to. And for many of us, if you think about how we actually use the car, we, in effect, pay to have it stored from the time that we get home at night, and then it sits idle from, say, 7 p.m. until 7 o'clock in the morning or 12 o'clock, 12 hours in which it just sits there. And we've built our houses to accommodate them. Quite extraordinary. And then we get in the car and we drive to work and it sits for another 8 hours. So these are the questions that millennials are asking themselves. And when we begin to ask ourselves that question, we don't have good answers for why we have the system in place that we do. It also affects things like mass transit. In many of the communities we've worked at, there's huge debates. There is in my hometown of Austin. Certainly there has been in Seattle and Phoenix and elsewhere. Why are we making the investments in mass transit when mass transit has never solved the problem of how you get from the transit stop to your home without having some private vehicle? And if, in fact, autonomous vehicles become the norm, what value is that mass investment in transit really doing for us? I don't want to try to answer that question right now. I don't know the answer to it. But these are the kinds of issues that are raised and why we're talking about disruptive trends. So let's take a look at those questions of the social norms and social disruption. What are the lessons from the election, and what can we expect from the new administration? And this is really not a political discussion. This is a discussion about how a new administration who has come in to office basically promising to recapture the manufacturing jobs that were lost, and how that's going to play out for us as economic developers. So let's take a look at the election and how it, most of you know this already, how it actually played out in the nation. And this is how the vote went by population area. And blue is metro areas of 1 million or more, and blue is blue vote for the Democrat, Hillary Clinton. And the sort of orangey red there is Republican candidate, Donald Trump. And you see that the larger, almost on a linear scale, the larger the area, the population area, the more likely it was to go Democrat. The smaller the area, the more likely it was to go Republican. Now there's another correlation here, and that is where the manufacturing jobs are, and also where natural resource industries are. And in those two areas which have felt the most profound job loss, as we saw earlier from the manufacturing sector, again correlates very highly with the voting pattern. So the disruption, the social disruption, is one that, looking back now with the luxury of hindsight, made this election much more predictable than any of the pollsters thought. Because the moment he began to speak to a segment of the population whose chances for employment had diminished tremendously because of an economy that no longer needed to hire people with low skills, this was the consequence. This was the social upheaval that now, retrospectively, is very predictable. So I'm sure I'll get some questions about that. But again, the point that I'd like to make here is not a political point. It's a point about the composition of the workforce and the change that's occurred primarily, we will argue, due to technology. And one last non-political point is that this was not a point of debate during the election. And this is the quite astonishing thing for us as observers of this, which is that all three candidates, I'm including Bernie Sanders now, all of them were making the same argument that the effect on the manufacturing sector was due to offshoring, and that if we could bring those jobs back, then the economy would recover. Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump were all making the same argument. And it's our position from the point of view of the economy and from economic development that that's not the case at all. That the loss of jobs due to outsourcing is the smaller percentage compared to the disruption caused by technology. And even if we reshore some of those jobs, they will not be and cannot be regained, and the percent of people working in manufacturing will not increase significantly. So this is why the disruption question is so important. So what are the signals from the new administration? So moving beyond the election to the new administration. So here are the signals. We don't know how any of these are going to play out yet, but we looked at 8 of them. First is oil and gas. If the administration sticks to its promises and we go back to a heavier use of coal, which I think is unlikely for a number of reasons, not least of which is that natural gas has been an important part and growing part of our economy, and by the way, made possible by huge advances in technology. So once again, the move toward coal seems unlikely to us, but it could in fact affect those of you who are in natural resource rich areas. The next is environmental regulations. There's a high likelihood that there will be a rollback of environmental regulations. And so those industries, those EDOs that are not squeamish about recruiting industries that have a higher likelihood of polluting will probably see some success. The third is an increase in privatization. Now, privatization question is tremendously important because it affects some of those communities, and we always advise against things like recruiting prisons, but increases in privatization of the prison industry is likely to increase again, and so creates opportunities, if you will, in that sector. And so we can go on this list, and I don't want to take up a lot of time on each of these. Corporate tax rates, healthcare, of course, is constantly in the news. The privatization in healthcare is one possibility. At the same time, we're getting signals, again, these are all signals, that a more European model may actually arise. And a more European model means one thing in healthcare that certainly has not been talked about before, but that the incoming administration seems to be willing to discuss, and that's price controls. So what that means for pharmaceuticals is going to be most interesting. Immigration. Our agricultural sectors, many other sectors of the service economy are actually heavily dependent on immigrants. So how that will play out is an important question. Interest rate, we've already seen a rise in interest rates. That rise is almost certain to continue. And finally, federal stimulus. The investment around infrastructure that is being promised by the incoming administration won't be possible without some federal stimulus money. So these are the signals we're getting. And these are the constraints to them. And in respect of your time, I'm not going to go into all of these either. But the biggest constraint, of course, and one we've been talking about is technology. Technology constrains what any administration can do in its promise for job creation. And we will demonstrate that because I think it's probably the most important point in this entire webinar. You can see some of those other ones. The demographics have great constraints of their own. You've got an aging workforce that will soon be retiring. The federal deficit, we haven't been taught. No one, the other amazing thing about this last election is that I think all 3 candidates were misleading on manufacturing. All 3 were misleading on the federal deficit, which of course is not going away and continues to increase. Changing consumer preferences make it very unlikely that certain kinds of jobs will return. One thing I like to point out about technological change is that this is not taking place from some secret cave somewhere. It's taking place because we as consumers want this to happen. The reason there are ATMs out there is because we want ATMs. They're hugely convenient for us, and we can get cash 24 hours a day and not have to wait for a bank to open. Many of you who are older remember that it was a great nuisance to try to even get money sometimes. You had to wait in line in banks, and now you don't. So this changing consumer preferences is one of the hugest drivers in technology and reinforces a lot of what we were talking about with gig economy and with the non-ownership model. So let's end with talking about what this means for economic development. And we'll spend the next 10 minutes, and thank you for your patience, and I hope you've all had your coffee. I'm still on the West Coast, so I'm ready for my second cup. But what does it mean for economic development? So here's the single most profound chart that I can show you, and it's one that I hope you take back to your boards and to your constituents. Because what this simple little graph shows is the average annual employment, compared with the GDP. So up until about 2000, job growth corresponded to productivity, to the GDP. And what we see, indexing it from 2000 on, is that we've had huge growth in the gross domestic product, 30%, but jobs have only increased 7%. So this chart is the one that I think all economic developers need to pay extremely close attention to, because what it tells us in unmistakable terms is that the industries that we most want, the ones that pay the most, the ones that have the most capital investment, are the least likely to create jobs. And the jobs that are being created are disproportionately both in lower income sectors of the economy and in ones that are most vulnerable to being replaced, not outsourced, but being replaced by technology. So this is an extraordinarily important chart. Our conclusion at TIP Strategies is that innovation will destroy millions of jobs, that there is no returning from that reality. At the same time, that the reshoring of our manufacturing will not replace those jobs that we have thought of as our primary high-wage jobs. So by 2020, the U.S. is expected to create 55 million job openings, almost half of which will be in entirely new positions. So that's an extraordinary corollary, if you will, to this fact that millions of jobs will be destroyed, but we'll be creating many, many jobs, 24 million of them, according to the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, that don't even exist yet. And when you look at, this is a little bit hard for you to read, I don't know how close you can get to your screen. This is from Burning Glass Technologies, a little bit about a year ago. We looked at the most in-demand skills in 15 different business functions. So what you see on the left is the overall, and then we've kind of blown up the top portion of that. And you look at the career areas across the top. So basically all the major job categories: clerical, finance, engineering, sales, and so forth. And based on 25 million job postings, asking employers what skills were the most important skills, and that included a whole range of things, including very technical skills. The most important in every job category was communication skills. So the employers themselves are beginning to recognize that what they most need from an incoming workforce is not merely the technical skills that they have required in the past. Not that those aren't important, but that if you don't have good communication skills, then you're not likely to get good jobs. And your most likely category of people with good communication skills, also those that are more highly educated. So this is an extraordinary shift from what we have seen in the past. Now your question is going to be, to me, as is our question to ourselves, what are the industries and the jobs of the future? I said when we started that I'm not a futurist, and I don't know the answer to this question. We're on the same search that you are about what this is all going to look like. And the question, of course, is how should the economic development and workforce communities respond to this change? Well, one thing we have done, however, and this is by way of closing, is to see how not to do it. And this is why targeted industries and workforce initiatives so typically fail. Because let's go back to that trucking example. We identify a need. We say the trucking industry needs almost 1 million new truck drivers. Huge demand, very limited supply. So we begin to establish programs both in workforce and in economic development to try to fill that need. At the same time that we're trying to respond to this demand, industry is on its own track. And it's saying, what can I do with technology rather than with the workforce as I currently find it in order to solve it? And they implement those solutions. So demand shrinks while supply increases. And suddenly you find yourself with target industry recruitment programs that are targeting industries that don't need workers or need them at a far lower level or with entirely different skills than they have in the past. Or we set up massive training programs, and those massive training programs are training people for jobs that don't exist any longer or that need different skills than the ones that the job training people are providing. So again, to that earlier question, what industries will not be affected by this? All industries will be affected by it. And we need to rethink our target industries. We need to rethink what it is that we want to incentivize, which brings us to our last slides. So what do we do next? Without knowing what those jobs are going to be or how disruption is going to affect industries in our own communities, we need to ask these questions. If productivity doesn't bring job gains, then what are we incentivizing? Well, at the minimum, we need new incentive policies. Because one thing that is very important to say, and those of you who have heard me talk about this in the past will recognize this, but business is not in the business of creating jobs. This is obvious to everyone who has been in business, and it seems to never quite sink in with the economic development community. And allow me to say it one more time. Business is not in the business of creating jobs. That's not why business exists. They will play the jobs game with you because they know that your incentive policies reward it. But let me ask you this. If you have a company that you have recruited and who receives incentives because of the number of jobs that they have committed to, and then new technologies become available, which they will have to, that business will have to implement in order to stay competitive, and by doing so reduce its workforce because labor is almost the highest component of any manufactured good. Are you prepared to bring in clawback provisions to take that incentive away from them because they haven't created the jobs? Or do you want them to remain competitive? And the only way that you and your boards and your executive directors can tackle this question is by rethinking your incentive policy. Second, I can't find workers. That is the common complaint of every community that we've worked in, I think that Golden Shovel has worked in, or that Anatolio and his folks have worked in at GIS planning. Well, we need a fresh approach to the labor market. Of course you can't find the workers. And to begin this discussion in a fresh and more creative way is to say, can we rethink our relationship with employers who say they can't find workers in terms of the gig economy, in terms of the actual use is a funny word here, but actual ways to address that portion of the population that has not appeared in the workforce for some period of time. Because as you know, and it's another big debate during the election, what is the actual unemployment rate? Well, the unemployment rate is not our stated unemployment rate. The simple reason that when you quit looking for work, you're no longer listed as unemployed. Those people are still out there. How we tap into those is going to be the creative endeavor, certainly for the next 10 years. The next is my metrics aren't telling me what I need to know. That's almost certainly true. We need new benchmarks. We need new ways of thinking about the ways that communities relate to their businesses overall. And by businesses overall, I mean not only those that you would seek to recruit, but those that you see as expanding. And that includes everything from economic gardening to the more traditional business and retention programs, expansion and retention programs. And then finally, with a nod to our friends at Golden Shovel, my marketing isn't reaching the audiences I want. We have to rethink the channels of marketing. This is not TIP's expertise, but we see community after community spending massive amounts of money on taglines and brands way ahead of their understanding of even what their assets are. They haven't thought through the structure of their current business environment. They haven't thought through the workforce needs of the businesses they'd like to recruit. And they certainly haven't thought through the way that technology is impacting those businesses. I know that's true because it's true in every community that we worked in. And there's huge resistance within many of the communities that we see toward the realization that this technology is going to replace those jobs. And it comes in odd ways, it comes out of left field, and it comes in ways that we almost never expect until it's hit us full force. So with that, I'm going to end with one futurist slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. And that futurist slide is the next level of the autonomous vehicle. And my daughter asked me sort of facetiously the other day, Dad, where are the flying cars? She was joking about how everyone in the 60s thought that the flying car was the future, and it never happened. Well, in fact, it is happening, but it's not happening in the way that we expected it to happen. What you're looking at is an actual drone, an autonomous drone, designed to pick up and deliver individuals. And this thing is being tested right now in Nevada. It's a Chinese company, and this drone will come and presumably land somewhere close to you. You'll be able to get into it, and it will fly you autonomously to your destination. Do I know this will happen? No. Does it seem likely? Not particularly. But the reality is that this thing exists. It can ferry people around. And if it does, it will be a disruption of transportation, even unlike any that we have thought about before. So with that quirky ending, I want to thank you for participating in this. I hope you found this of value, and I think we'll have some time for Q&A that will be managed by Golden Shovel. So thank you all very much again for participating.
John, thank you for giving that presentation. It was absolutely fascinating, perhaps a little scary. There's certainly a lot of change that's going on that, you know, I kind of wish you were a futurist so you could tell us what's going to happen. I want to just recommend anybody that's attending right now that they'd like to submit further questions to please type them in on the right. We're going to take a few questions for the top of the hour here. My first question for you, John, is you talked about the changing metrics of measuring successful economic development. And do you have some insights or further thoughts on what might be measured that'll be different? Other
Absolutely.
than just jobs.
We have been looking at this, and one of the things that we are very aware of is that this process of change within the economic development organizations is a slow one. And so we're going to have to continue to measure jobs, but we can nuance the job question by skills and by income. That will help us make the transition. Additionally, we're going to have to look much harder at capital investment and how we measure it. But we're also going to have to look at a whole series of other indicators that have not been part of the way that economic development organizations measure community success. And so let's hold that topic. I think we can provide you with that list. and have discussions around it. But it's a very important point. And suffice it to say for now that there have to be social indicators that are part of your overall metrics that weren't nearly as important as they have been in the past.
Great. We've had multiple requests to get these slides. If there'd be a chance that people can share them with the board, is that going to be available?
They will be. And what Meredith in our office will do is work with you at Golden Shovel to get them out. We'll put our TRP watermark on all of them so that people can use them freely. But that so the work we have done on it will also be acknowledged.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Another question came in. How will technology disrupt the goal of tax-based diversifying?
Ask that question again. Let me make sure I understand it.
Sure. It says, how will technology disrupt the goal of tax-based diversifying?
So I don't know that it will disrupt it. It probably, the question of a diversified tax base is something that we can look at as an indicator, since you started with that question, and keep it, and almost certainly keep that as an indicator, because diversification is almost always a net gain for a community. Now, one way to answer that question is to look at the effects of diversification over time. So it varies from community to community. There are tourist-based communities who have been hugely successful in terms of doubling down on the value of tourism and making sure that they don't bring in industries that would disrupt that tourism. So I wouldn't immediately jump into a you have to diversify strategy as the only successful indicator of a community. I think it has to be looked at in the broader context of the regional competitiveness of an area. It's a complicated answer, and strategic planning helps answer that particular question. Diversification is always good, but it is not inherently the right strategy to follow. It depends tremendously on the particular industry that is most prevalent in that community or region. And it's against that backdrop that we can say we should or shouldn't diversify. Now, on the technology question, I think that the important part there is that you are vulnerable to technology change across all industries. And if you're dependent on only one industry and technology disrupts that industry, then you really are in the most vulnerable of positions. So we can go back to, is a diversified economy better than a single economy? In most cases, yes, and should be worked on to at least explore the possibility of what compatible industries to your primary industry would be. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was excellent. One further question. As far as rural communities in comparison with maybe a larger urban and metro communities, although they might be hesitant to change, is it easier for a small community to move quicker and adapt to these changes, considering how dramatic they're going to be? Do you see that there being an opportunity for?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want to speak in the abstract. Let me talk about specific instances. A community with strong leadership, a community where the city manager or the county commissioners and the economic development organization are really on the same page, and as a small community, their potential for change and positive growth is tremendous. And to me, that example in our experience is Tupelo, Mississippi. Very small community south of Memphis. You know, it is home, birthplace of Elvis Presley. But Tupelo is a small town that had that united leadership. We had the privilege of working there. They worked on every aspect of community health. Fort Collins, I know that some folks are in the vicinity of Fort Collins. Now, Fort Collins is a special case. Unlike Tupelo, it has a major university, but still a small town. Tremendous growth, and also because of very close relationships between the city and the economic development organizations that were able to say, we know that economic development is more than just growth. We have to talk about economic health. And that has paid huge dividends for them. So I see tremendous opportunities for small rural areas, especially ones that are not constrained by, we have to preserve the industries that we have. And this gets back to the diversification of the tax base question. And I'll pick on one of more of the communities that we worked in who refused to even entertain the possibility that manufacturing is not going to be the mainstay of their economic growth. And I don't want to cite individual examples now, but I certainly could. And their unwillingness to look at the possibility of change, I think, could potentially doom them. And by doom, I mean result in no new business growth, a declining wage base, and the outmigration of their young talent.
Wow. All right. Well, thanks for sharing today and sharing all these thoughts. This gives I think all of our audience and attendees a lot to think about. Just want to thank you again for your time, and thank you for everybody that came in to listen to our expert webinar series today. You can feel free to get in touch with Victor at vperez, P-E-R-E-Z, at goldenshovel.com, and we can get you copies of the slides once they're provided to us. And that said, thank you so much. Thank you, John.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.